Hi everyone, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be painting a variegated pothos plant, which was a request by All Might. So let's just start by drawing it out first. It's actually quite simple, just like any leafy plants. The shape of the leaves are quite special as they're shaped as hearts with longer and sharper tip with a midrib and the veins along the side. The veins, however, is a little bit different to the basic leaf shape because we're following the heart shape this time. And because this is variegated, there are also going to be light yellow or white spots on the leaves as well. The stems are quite thick for this plant and they can air root, so sometimes you can start to see the roots developing even when they're out of the water or soil, and they usually grow by shooting out this thick knobs at the bottom of some sections of the stem. So those are basically the main features, and of course you can draw this in different sizes as well as different angles, but what I think makes this painting come to life is being able to add on the different folds when you see it in different angles, and this is something that you can practice individually. I mentioned this before, but a trick is having a cut piece of paper in the shape of the leaf and trying to curve certain parts and use that as reference if the plant itself isn't available for you. So I'm just going to draw out a few while combining it together, but as practice I would suggest for you to paint them one by one so it's a bit clearer to see and to study. Then once you're done, you can just draw them and combine them together so you create a cluster and it's a bit easier for you to visualize. Now I'm going to go over the colors, which are quite basic colors, and I'm also going to show you a little bit on how I'm going to mix the greens. I'm going to be using two main greens for this painting, which are Hooker's Green by Cotman and Permanent Green number 2 by Holbein. Then here I have my Oralin Yellow, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Umber, Ivory Black, White, and I'm also going to use my Winsor & Newton White Gouache for the end. Then for additional colors, I'm also going to be using Vermilion and Composed Blue. So like I mentioned before, the main greens that I'm going to be using are Hooker's Green and Permanent Green number 2. As you can see, Hooker's Green is much darker and the Permanent Green is more like a mid-tone, but I want to use the mid-tone green as my main green because I want to be able to create a lighter color with that by mixing it in with the Oralin Yellow also. So basically this depends on the type of plant that you want to paint. The one that I have personally at home is the neon type, so I want to replicate that with the lighter green, but if you want to create yours a bit darker, you can also use the Hooker's Green also. So the main color mixture that I like using for this is actually a mixture of the Permanent Green number 2 and Oralin Yellow with a little bit of Yellow Ochre. So I'm just going to show you first what it looks like if I mix only the Oralin Yellow. As you can see, the green is much lighter and brighter. It's similar to what Permanent Green number 1 would look like. Now by adding the Yellow Ochre, now you will see that the green will turn more into a muted light green instead, because the Yellow Ochre has that slightly muddy brown tone. And basically that is the mixture that I'm going to use the most, but I'm just going to play around with the ratio, whether I want the green to look a little bit more cooler by adding more of the Permanent Green number 2 or warmer by adding either the yellow or the Yellow Ochre. As I've shown you before, the Yellow Ochre makes it a bit more muted whilst the yellow makes it a bit brighter, so that is something that you can adjust according to what you want to create. This is what color mixing is about. It doesn't necessarily mean that a certain ratio like 50-50 or 40% 60% of this color will create this, but it's more having to understand the feel and what you want to create for your own painting. And as an example, I'm just going to show you what the colors will look like if I added the Hooker's Green. It's basically going to do the same thing, but because the Hooker's Green is a much darker green, you're going to create something that looks a bit deeper. But as you can see from the first swatch, now this one is a little bit more natural looking and is a bit more muted compared to the bright cooler green. This is why I choose to use the Hooker's Green more for the shadows of my painting, and I'm just going to show you by mixing in some of the darker colors now. So the Hooker's Green, Burnt Umber, and Ivory Black, So I'm going to mix all of those three colors together, and you will see that I can create a very dark green, and yet the green is still saturated from the hooker's green, but those two colors from the ivory black and burnt umber will help to deepen it further. The reason why I tend to add a lot of yellows or brown colors to my greens is because I gravitate towards more of the warm greens. I just like those tones a bit better, but if you like more of a cooler green, you can also add blues or purples to your greens as well. I also forgot to mention, but I used basically a little bit of white, yellow ochre, and yellow to create the variegation and the base color for this, but I'm just going to show you that when we get to painting. So let's just start to paint now, and I just want to get my colors ready. So I'm going to activate some Orlin yellow, yellow ochre, as well as the permanent green number 2. And then I'm going to take some of the white because we're going to start with the lightest color, which is the color of the variegated leaves. My brush was technically still a little bit dirty from the yellow ochre and the yellow, and I took some of the white, so I created a very light yellow color, and with this I'm going to paint the heart shape for the leaves. You can try to draw this first to find the composition that you like, but for this painting I'm just going to go straight to painting because we're technically just repeating the same shapes over and over again and playing with the angles a little bit. So what I do is when I'm still a little bit unsure about the composition, I try to start with a couple first and try to test it out before painting a whole bunch of them all at once. This is why I'm just starting with 2 of them first, and then I'm trying out the lighter green mixture to see how I would apply the variegated texture and slowly build up the green. But once you get the feel of it, you can just use straight up mid-tone green or whatever neon or darker green that you would like to create the variegation with. So this is the green that I'm actually going to use all throughout, and after layering with this green, I'm pretty sure you'll notice that the previous layer is almost non-existent. So this is technically how I try certain things if I'm still a little bit unsure. Once I'm done with these couple of trials, I ended up painting a few of them all at once. I'm not going to paint all at once, but I like to work little by little and see what I'm comfortable with and then just slowly building it up. So I'm just going to repeat the steps, and since I haven't mentioned before, the way I like to add the variegated texture is by first defining where the midrib is and then painting by following the curvature of the leaves and leaving out a little bit of negative space at the same time. By now I was quite comfortable with how I was painting the front-facing leaves in different sizes and different directions, so I decided to include the leaves which are viewed sideways and also include little bits of folds. Painting these variegated types are less unnerving in my opinion because I am starting with a very light pale yellow, and this is a good chance for me to map out the placement of the leaves without being overly worried about accuracy, since it's easier to layer on the light colors. But once you're comfortable, you can also use straight green if you would like to paint the non-variegated ones, and that's something that I'm also going to include, so there's a little bit of variety with the leaves. Then again, I'm just going to paint the variegation using the same green that I've been using. As you can probably tell, there's a slight difference in tone. That's because the ratio is a little bit different whenever I mix the green after I run out. But I think this actually makes the leaves look more natural in my opinion. So don't stress over mixing something that is exactly the same all the time, or to get the same green that I have in my tutorials, you can really play around and experiment yourself using the color palette that you have. In fact, I always prefer to have tiny changes than having complete consistency with colors, because that tend to make the painting look a little bit flat. So the green here, as you can tell, is a little bit warmer and golden. This is because I use more yellow and yellow ochre in the ratio, and because I've got a fair amount of leaves now, I'm going to build up on some of the green layers of the leaves by introducing a slightly more pigmented or thicker paint. But I'm still adding more leaves whenever I feel like the space is a little bit empty. The main thing that I try to build at this point, because I've mapped out the rough composition of how the leaves are going to flow out of the vase, I want to make the center, or where the plants are growing from, a little bit more dense, which is why I'm also adding leaves behind the ones that I've painted. I just want to make sure that everything in the foreground is dry first, so it wouldn't blend with each other. Another point is that I always try to vary the value of those leaves which are touching or painted on top of each other, so those leaves will look separate from each other and you also have the feel of depth. Now that I have a fair amount of leaves, I'm going to connect some of the stems together, and I'm still using the same mixture for the stems, but I made sure that it's quite pigmented so the stems are nice and visible. Here I'm also starting to add a bit of shadows and little outlines to separate the individual leaves, and for this I used the same mixture in a thick consistency, still with added ivory black. As I mentioned when I explained about the color mixtures, you don't have to follow this exactly. You can start to use hooker's green or even add some burnt umber. At this point I'm just looking for a slightly darker shade of green for me to build the layers with. In this area here, I filled in some of the white space to add depth and also to make this part of the plant look more dense. You can always go back to any of the previous steps whenever you need to, like adding more leaves to balance out the composition. But here I also added some dry leaves because I think that this makes the painting look a little bit more interesting. Sometimes I like to include imperfections to make it look more natural, and for the dried leaves I just made a brown color using some yellow ochre and a tiny bit of burnt umber. I also used this color to add on to the tips of some of the leaves as accents. Next I'm going to paint the vase, and for this I decided to make a glass vase, so I used some compost blue and mixed it with a bit of permanent green and ivory black. Then I start to line the shape using a very thin consistency, so it's much easier to fix if I accidentally make a mistake. I'm just going to do a circular glass vase peeking through the leaves. Once I've laid out the light outline of the structure, I use the tip of my brush with a thicker consistency paint to line the outer part really thinly. I also added very light colors with a little bit of white negative space as highlight, so the vase looks more visible and it separates it more from the leaves. Then using white with the green mixture, I added the stems in the vase or the jar. I painted 3 main stems, then I added a touch of brown for the ends as well as some of the thick roots. Then I add the long and thin roots using a mix of white gouache and the light green mixture. The reason why I'm using white gouache this time is because I'm making a lighter color since the roots are lighter than the stem. and the white gouache will help the color be more opaque than just using the watercolor that I have. So the roots are very opaque and visible on top of the color of the jar. After I painted the roots and the stems, I felt like the left side looks a little bit empty. I do like the asymmetrical composition, but I'd like to still add a little bit of weight on the left side in a different length, and also make some of the leaves peek through behind the jar. So at this point, I'm just going to balance everything out by adding smaller leaves to fill in some space, and also add additional shadows by using the darkest mixture of the green, which is from mixing Hooker's Green, Burnt Umber, and Ivory Black. And I put them as shadows as well as thin outlines on some of the leaves. So here you can finish off the painting by adding a plant stand or something like that, but I decided to give this one a plant hanger, so I'm just going to mix a creamy muted green color using the colors that I already have on my palette, and paint some of the beads at the top where the ropes will join together. And as for the rope, I used a mixture of white, burnt umber, vermilion, and the light green mix that was previously on my palette to mute the red slightly. Then I just made some knots at the bottom where the ropes are coming together to finalize the hanging planter. After that, I just do final adjustments like adding more definition with the darker green for some of the leaves and things like that to finish off the painting and get the balance that I'm looking for. So thank you All Might for requesting this. He or she requested for money plant or devil's ivy, and honestly I thought money plants looked like those round peperomia plants, but apparently it looks the same as a variegated pothos, which worked out great for me because we have heaps of those in the garden. But I have green ones as well, and a neon variegated pothos, which I combined together in a glass bottle in my room, so that worked out great. Anyway, that's it for the final painting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end. Like usual, all of the links to my social media as well as the tools that I used will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!